Before I begin today's lecture, I just want to apologize to those of you that showed up at a 1 o'clock tutorial on Monday and found nobody there. It was not due to a fault of mine or any of the TAs, but rather to a miscommunication between the department and the registrar. The list of tutorials that the registrar sent to the department didn't include that one, and thus the TA didn't know that there was a session meeting. We have resolved the problem in the meantime. There will certainly be somebody there on next Monday, and those of you that attended that tutorial and found nobody there certainly will not be penalized in any way for having missed the tutorial. So again, my apologies for that bit of confusion. The second bit of business that I wanted to take up before we take up today's lecture is that I had a request from students last week at the end of class to revisit our earlier vote about having a break halfway through the class. As I explained in the first class, my overall preference and the preference of most students that I've encountered has been for me to not have a break and to aim for letting you guys out a bit early, 10-15 minutes early. But I understand that that's sometimes a bit of a tall order for people, so I, on this rare occasion, turned the classroom into a democracy to make that decision. So let me retake that vote. How many of you would prefer to have a break halfway through the class? Okay, the numbers have slightly increased. How many of you would prefer to try to get out a little bit earlier? I'm afraid the former have once again lost that vote. I apologize to those of you that prefer a break. For the time being, we're going to keep it where it's at. Okay, what I want to do today is to pick up where we left off last class. And last class, you might recall, we explored the emergence of the international system of states, which we called the Westphalian State System. The Westphalian State System, named after the Peace of Westphalia that was signed in 1648 in the city of Münster, and that brought an end to the 30 Years' War, and created, for all intents and purposes, the notion of sovereignty. In other words, that whoever is in control, whoever is the ruler of a particular territory, enjoys complete sovereignty within that territory, and recognition of that sovereignty by his neighbors. A series of other treaties, like the Treaty of Utrecht, established some of the other components of the modern state system, such as diplomatic recognition and diplomatic immunity and things along those lines. But suffice it to say that that is how the system of states initially came into being. Now, the purpose of discussing all of this was not to provide you with an understanding of history. Most of you have taken history classes and have probably gone into far more detail on the various aspects of the history of Europe and the world that we covered last class, but rather to establish how the existing system of states came into being. And that is something that is of significant importance by virtue of the fact that how the system of states came into being helps us to understand the problems that some of those states face in the state system today. As such, one of the things that we noted is that while the state system established itself in Western Europe on the basis of essentially small wielders of force, like Frederick William of Prussia, using their ability to coerce, in other words, their control of armed forces, to extract resources from a population over which they had control, to use those resources in order to expand their power base, their ability to wield force, their army, use that force in order to expand their territory, use that expanded territory to raise more resources, and so on and so forth. And while Frederick William rather, was one of the first to initiate that, the situation that it created for other wielders of force, for other communities, is fairly evident. Essentially, they were presented with a situation where they had only two choices. Either to try to imitate that process by themselves becoming wielders of force, able to defend their territory, or they would become gobbled up by those that did imitate the process that Prussia began. As such, nation-states, or states, I should say, became established throughout Europe. And we then looked at how that system spread to other parts of the world, and noted that it spread to other parts of the world to a large extent through the process of colonialism. Colonialism introduced a state system, or something like the European system, first and foremost in the Western Hemisphere. And in the Western Hemisphere, the states that exist today are essentially the administrative districts of the colonial powers that ruled over that territory after the discovery of the Western Hemisphere by Europeans. and left, as I suggested, also a social structure that was likewise imported from Western Europe, meaning that the Spanish and the Portuguese in particular in Central and South America created large plantations that mimicked the feudal estates in Western Europe, granted those enormous estates to Europeans willing to move to the Americas, and provided them with the power to access labor in the form of either slavery or indentured servitude, or in the Spanish system of encomiada. Again, I don't want to give you a history lesson, and I've painted over a great deal of detail in this regard. Suffice it to say that that is how the state system arrived in the Western Hemisphere, and for the most part, insofar as it has changed by virtue of the fact that all of the territories in the Western Hemisphere gained their independence from the European colonial powers that first established these states. In East Asia, this process was slightly different. It was slightly different in large part because what the European colonizing powers encountered in South and East Asia were much more well-developed civilizations that were far less vulnerable to European power than what they had encountered in the Western Hemisphere. And consequently, rather than simply displacing those civilizations, European colonial powers, for the most part, co-opted the elites that already governed those territories. In particular, that was the case in India, to a lesser extent in China. Nonetheless, they imposed, as part of that colonial process, first and foremost, the notion of territory, which never really had a great deal of meaning in the context of South and East Asia. Essentially, like most of the rest of the world prior to the emergence of states, what pervaded in China were centers of power that wielded a great deal of force over certain territory, and less force as you got further and further away from those centers of power. And consequently, there were conflicting claims between various centers of power on the fringes of their ability to govern. Instead, the Europeans, for the most part, imposed the notion of boundaries of territory on those states. And again, after these states gained their independence, they became the states that now make up the modern system in that region of the world. In Africa, which was later to participate in that process, essentially we saw the scramble for Africa and a much more haphazard imposition of boundaries that did not take into account of the existing power centers, the existing civilizations, the existing tribal groups and ethnic groups within the region, and simply drew lines fairly arbitrarily across the continent and assigned territory to various European powers. And that in turn created situations in which individual colonies consisted of numerous different ethnic groups that had little or nothing in common with each other, and that in many cases had substantial animosities toward each other. And furthermore, they tended to inflame those animosities by privileging one group over another as a means of controlling those territories. And that in turn had profound ramifications when, after the Second World War, these countries began to gain their independence. In other words, independence almost invariably led to conflict, and in many cases civil war within those colonies between these various ethnic and religious and tribal factions. The last place that the state system arrived on the planet was in the Middle East. In the Middle East, largely by virtue of the fact that the modern Middle East was throughout most of the period when states became established and when Europeans sought colonies, governed over by the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire created many problems for the Europeans. Among them were that it made it difficult to access Asian markets and Asian sources of goods. It forced the Europeans to travel all the way around the African continent to access places like India and the Spice Islands and so on. And that, of course, was one of the powerful motivations for going west instead, and one of the reasons that the Europeans discovered the Western Hemisphere. Suffice it to say, however, that the Ottoman Empire collapsed as a result of its involvement in the First World War on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary, and essentially left a power vacuum behind that was filled, that was hoping to be filled by the colonial powers of Europe. Britain and France were very keen to establish colonies in that region, given that they were aware of the wealth of resources that existed in that region. But were, to some extent, prevented from doing so by the League of Nations mandate set up by the United States. In other words, the first attempts to draw boundaries were reached as a result of the Sykes-Picot Agreement between France and England in 1916. But they were not able to establish colonies in that region, but were instead granted a League of Nations mandate to administer governments in that region, or to create governments in that region to govern those territories themselves. And as I pointed out, the British and the French did not do that as disinterested forces, but rather created a system of states that was intentionally weak and easy for them to dominate, so that they could gain access to those resources and so on. Why is all of that important? It's important by virtue of the fact that we are currently seeing a situation in which the nation-state system that came into, the state system I should say, that came into existence in 1648 and spread from European, is beginning to change, is beginning to decline, is beginning to fall apart. And we're noticing that in particular in regions like Africa and of course in the Middle East. And that shouldn't surprise us too much. It shouldn't surprise us in large part because we would expect that system of states to be most brittle and most vulnerable in places where it was least well established and where the foundations for it were the weakest. And quite clearly, as I pointed out, that would have been in the case of Africa and in the case of the Middle East. In both cases, what the manifestation of that failure of the state system is the notion of failed states. Failed states. States that essentially have lost the ability to control their own territory, that have lost that crucial function of the state, which is to monopolize the legitimate use of force, coercion, and violence within their own territory. Many African states never had that from the time of their independence, in large part because their independence was gained by various insurgencies against colonial rule, which meant that even when the colonial powers granted independence and created a government, in many cases there were other militias that were still fighting against that government created by the European colonial powers, meaning that they were still in a state of semi-civil war. The same thing is to a large extent true, of course, of the Middle East as well. In the case of Africa, these failed states were in some cases the result of outside intervention, but in many cases were simply the result of the weakness of their economies, the weakness of their state structures, and certain shocks that they encountered, in particular in the form of things like droughts. Droughts that put extreme stress on the governments that tried to control those territories, and created a weakness on their part that was taken advantage of by various armed groups that battled against those states. That certainly was the case in Liberia, in Sierra Leone, in places like Sudan, to a certain extent in Somalia. In each of those cases, one of the main problems with these states is what has often become known as the resource curse. The resource curse, which can probably be best seen in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo. Meaning that in order to run an insurgency against a central government, in the case of the Democratic Republic, the government that is located in Kinshasa, you need resources. Guns aren't cheap. Feeding armies isn't cheap. And lo and behold, there are enormous amounts of resources in many of these countries, and resources that lend themselves very well to maintaining illegal militaries and guerrilla armies and so on. In other words, resources like diamonds and gold and coltan and so on, that can be relatively easy mined independently of heavy technology and so on, and furthermore can't be traced and are extremely small and therefore can be transported across borders relatively easily or smuggled across borders, and can provide these various militias with the ability to buy arms. Their ability to raise arms and the inability of the state to collect enough taxes and to raise a strong enough army to defeat these militaries mean that these states ultimately fail. Now, in Africa, of course, there were also a couple of states that failed because of outside intervention, most notably the state of Libya. The state of Libya was a relatively well-governed state under the dictatorship of Muammar Gaddafi, well governed, I don't mean that I would want to live there, or that Muammar Gaddafi was an angel or anything of that sort. He was certainly a rather authoritarian government, or a governor. But at the end of his rule, the international organizations like the United Nations ranked Libya as the highest country on the Human Development Index in all of Africa, meaning that they had accomplished a considerable amount under that state. It has since then fallen apart completely, and fallen apart largely because of Western intervention, and essentially become a failed state. Currently, there are two governments that claim to govern Libya. Neither of them control more than the immediate area around the places where they operate. One is in Tripoli. It controls the capital city, but little outside of it, and much of the city itself is still not directly under their control. That government is not recognized by Western powers or the international community. The Western powers recognize a government that is located on in a city, in a hotel in a city on the shore of Libya. In a tourist hotel, but it exercises virtually no control beyond the town that it operates out of. And the UN estimates that there's around 1,500 separate militias that operate within the territory of Libya, meaning that Libya is far from having a state that exercises a monopoly on the legitimate use of force, coercion, and violence. The same thing is to some extent true of the Middle East. In the Middle East, likewise, the state system is starting to fall apart. It's starting to fall apart, again, because it was rather weakly established. And in the case of the Middle East, it was, again, outside interventions that have caused that state system to fall apart, beginning, most importantly, with the intervention by the United States and its allies in Iraq that overthrew the government of Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein's government was certainly not one to be imitated, and was certainly not, didn't have a great deal of merits, but it did hold together a country that consisted of minorities, such as the Kurdish minority in the north, the Shiite majority in the south, and the Sunni ruling minority, of which Saddam Hussein was a member, that occupied mostly the central and eastern regions, western regions of Iraq. The fact that that system fell apart and that the United States devoted little in the way of effort in terms of thinking of how to govern that territory once Saddam Hussein had been removed meant essentially that the majority faction within Iraq took power and used its power in a way that you would expect, in other words, in a sectarian way, to reward members of their own community and to a certain extent take revenge against their former oppressors, the Sunnis. That meant, first and foremost, that the Kurds no longer felt that they had anything to gain by being members of Iraq, and they created an autonomous region in the north. And secondly, that the Sunnis no longer felt any loyalty to the government in Baghdad. Now, the problem with the Middle East, as is the case with Africa, is that the problem in a country like Iraq very quickly spills across borders, because those borders were inherently artificial, were imposed and not imposed all that long ago. And consequently, the problem between Sunnis and Shiites in Iraq very quickly became problems between Sunnis and Shiites in Syria. Syria is a state that is under the control of a Shiite minority, the Alawite sect of Shiite Islam, the sect of Bashir al-Assad and his family. But the majority of the population of Syria is Sunni. And consequently, the resentments between Sunnis and Shiites very quickly led to civil war in Syria, and is threatening to spill over into other countries in the region that are equally weakly established as nation states. Probably the most vulnerable in that category is Lebanon, which has undergone throughout its history a number of civil wars between different factions, including Sunni and Shiite, but also Druze Christians and various other groups within that territory. In that sense, understanding how the state system came into being is of considerable importance to this day. It is not merely an academic exercise. What I want to do today is to move on a little bit beyond that, and first and foremost, by looking at the notion of something that we often consider as synonymous with states, and that is the idea of nation states, and the idea of nationalism. And the reality is that nation states are not the same as states. States are simply those entities that control a particular territory and a particular population and manage to exercise a monopoly on the legitimate use of force, coercion, and violence. But the vast majority of states did not govern over territories that consisted of homogeneous populations, even in Western Europe. And indeed, the majority of states had little concern for those that lived within their territory. And by contrast, those that lived within those states had little concern over the well-being of the state in which they lived. In large part because the states that emerged in Western Europe did not look at their citizens as important for anything other than as a source of resources, as something to be exploited. In other words, those that lived within their territory were the subjects of the rulers. The subjects. They had no rights, they had no role to play other than to provide the rulers with resources. And that meant that the populations had no loyalty to those that governed them. They looked at them for the most part as exploiters. And for the most part, those that governed territory saw themselves as entirely separate from the population over which they governed. They didn't think they had anything in common with them. They thought of themselves as royals, as entirely separate from the populations over which they governed. In many cases, they didn't even speak the same language as the people that they governed. What that meant is that wars that took place between the rulers of various territories were wars between professional armies, in which the general population had no stake whatsoever. And there's numerous stories of battles being carried on between various rulers of territory, in which the only role of the population is that they knew where the battlefield was likely to be, and therefore set up chairs and things along those lines on a hill overlooking the battlefield, and went out there and watched it as a great spectacle, as a form of entertainment. But who won? Who cared? Essentially, if one side won, it merely, and you fell into the territory of a neighboring wielder of force, it merely meant that they were collecting their taxes instead of the other group collecting their taxes. To the average person, it made no difference. That all changed as a result of one rupture in the European system of feudal states. And that rupture, as many of you are probably well aware, was the French Revolution. The French Revolution. The French Revolution overthrew the existing order by eliminating the monarchy and those that supported it. As it turned out, they didn't eliminate it well enough because the monarchy was reestablished, or attempted reestablishment several times thereafter. But suffice it to say, it was overthrown, at least in the short term, under the banner of equality, liberty, equality, and fraternity, as most of you are probably aware. That banner, that battle cry of liberty, equality, and fraternity was an outgrowth of the different political thoughts that emerged in the aftermath of the Enlightenment. In particular, the liberal political philosophers like Montesquieu, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and so on, that began to argue that the role of government was first and foremost to serve the public, to serve the citizens within a particular state. And in that sense, it brought about a considerable and important transition in which governments no longer looked at their population as subjects, but rather looked at them as citizens. And the measure of the legitimacy of states became the acceptance of those governors by those that are being governed. The notion of a social contract and so on that we briefly talked about last class. Equality in that regard was first and foremost a statement that there was no class of people that had greater rights than anyone else. And therefore there was no nobility that had the right to govern over everyone else without being empowered by those that are being governed to do so. The idea of liberty was the notion that all states, no matter how they come into being, have certain limitations to their ability and their rights to operate. And the limitations are the rights of their citizens. And lastly, the notion of fraternity was that humans that there's a fraternity of human beings. And the upshot of that is that the French very quickly felt that it was their obligation to liberate the rest of Europe from these oppressive institutions under which they were governed for so many centuries. And essentially, to make a very long story rather short, that latter part of the fraternity of spreading the benefits of liberty and equality to other parts of Western Europe and eventually the world was the main program of the leader that emerged from the chaos that took place during the French Revolution, and as most of you know, that is Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, the interesting thing about Napoleon Bonaparte is that he was the first to create a citizens' army. A citizens' army that was based on the loyalty to the leader, to the French Revolution, and to the principles that it embodied. In other words, it was the first time that the average person had a stake in the outcome of these various conflicts, and was willing to sacrifice because of their sense of nationalism, their sense of solidarity with their fellow citizens, not only their time and their effort, but if need be, their life. And again, that's in pretty sharp contrast to how armies had functioned prior to that. They were prior to the emergence of a national army like Napoleon's. Most of those that fought on the side of any wielder of force were mercenaries. And mercenaries really are loyal only insofar as they're being paid by the person that they're fighting for, and they certainly don't have much of an interest in dying in those kinds of battles. The upshot of that is that Napoleon's armies were enormously successful on battlefields, and that in turn meant that other wielders of force in Europe quickly recognized the benefits of moving away from a model of governed and subjects and toward a model of citizenship, of incorporating the governed into a political community and creating a sense of nationalism. In that sense, it should be pointed out that the states that exist in Europe, that at this point, for the most part, with some notable exceptions, govern over territories that are populated by people that all speak the same language, that all have the same ethnic backgrounds, and so on and so forth, was a historical development, not something that came naturally, meaning that states created these homogeneous populations, created those homogeneous populations where they previously did not really exist. And of course, they had several centuries to accomplish that goal. A good way of understanding that is, I was born in Germany. I was born in the city of Detmold in Germany, which is in northern central Germany. And when I was 2 years old, or 3 years old, we moved from there to Hesse, which is in southern central Germany. And the first thing that we noticed is that while we could understand everything that went on in our household, we couldn't understand most of the farm boys and girls that lived in the immediate neighborhood, because they spoke a completely different dialect that was virtually incomprehensible to people from a different region. Consequently, it took a couple of years until you got to develop an ear for that dialect and started speaking it yourself. And even then, if we went 50 kilometers to the east, we were in Bavaria. And there the dialect was, again, totally different to the extent that we couldn't really understand it. Basically, what that meant is that the German-speaking regions of Central Europe throughout the centuries had a certain common denominator in terms of the language structures and so on, but they were far from the same language. They were far from a homogeneous language that everyone spoke and everyone understood. They had enormous differences, and some of those differences were just as profound as the difference between the Danish language and the German language, or the Dutch language and the German language, all of which have common roots but are not the same language. The same language was imposed by the state because it served their purposes, to have an administration that could take place in a single language, and also to create a national identity and replace the local loyalties and the local cultures with a national culture, because that would become an easier way of then using that national culture to create a sense of nationalism and to project power outside. As such, states created these through a number of different methods. I already mentioned administration, which increasingly took place in the language of the dominant power. But very quickly that was followed by the establishment of public schools that, again, for the most part, offered instruction in the case of Germany, what is often called Hochdeutsch, to distinguish it from the various dialects spoken throughout Germany. That is the only form of German that you'll see in public schools. It's also the only form of German that you'll see on national television, radio, newspapers, and so on and so forth. And through these various institutions, essentially, Germany became homogenized into, and it still isn't completely homogenized, there's still important distinctions between different regions, but nonetheless, to the extent that you can call it a nation state. The French, of course, did that with the French Revolution, but various other powers followed suit, some more successfully than others, and some not successfully at all. So many of you might be aware that Switzerland is a state in Europe, but it is not a nation state. It is not a nation state because it consists of 4 different ethnic and linguistic groups. A French region where they speak French, a German region where they speak German, an Italian region where they speak Italian, and another region where they speak Romance, which is a sort of a hybrid of Italian and German. In that sense, it is not a nation state, but nonetheless is a state. It has also not ever projected power outside very effectively, partially out of choice. Another example of that kind of heterogeneity is Belgium. Belgium consists of a French-speaking majority and a Flemish minority. And it continues to have some problems in the relations between these 2 different language groups. Suffice it to say that nation states have become the dominant institution in Western Europe. But again, when you look outside of Western Europe, you start to see considerable problems in regard to nation states, in that most states in Africa, most states in the Middle East, and many states in other parts of the world do not consist of a single language group. India is probably one of the best examples. There are at least 20 different language groups in India itself, and the only thing that they have in common with each other is that the official language of all of them is English, and that was imposed, of course, by the British. And to a large extent, many in India are still, to a significant extent, thankful to the British for imposing that common denominator on the continent, but not for much else. So the emergence of nationalism is extremely important. Insofar as that it, first and foremost, facilitated the ability to mobilize forces for war. Now, in order to understand the international system as it exists today, we have to look a little bit at how the French Revolution had an impact on the emergence of, or the evolution of these states in Western Europe, and then to look at the Cold War that dominated the second half of the 20th century. In that regard, the reaction to Napoleon's attempt to spread equality, fraternity, and liberty to the rest of Europe was, of course, panic on the part of the rulers of the rest of Europe. Napoleon was not only extremely powerful, he also seemed to represent the aspirations of the local populations, and consequently was certainly a threat to the institution of monarchy, which dominated all of Europe. And that meant that what formed in opposition to Napoleon's forces was an alliance among all of the other powers of Europe, essentially to defeat Napoleon. That alliance was called the Holy Alliance, because, of course, the monarchs claimed that they were empowered by God to rule over their territories, the divine right of kings, and so on and so forth, and sort of shrouded themselves in religion in that context. Suffice it to say that they were ultimately successful in defeating Napoleon. And again, I don't want to go into too many historical details as to why and what battles took place where and so on. You can do that in history courses. The important thing for us is that what emerged out of that conflict was a system that was relatively stable. And essentially maintained peace in Western Europe and therefore in the rest of the world for much of the 19th century. And that system that emerged was referred to as the Concert of Europe. The Concert of Europe. Sounds like a groovy thing, but there was no music involved. The Concert of Europe merely refers to the arrangement that was made in Europe to leave, or that remained in Europe after the defeat of Napoleon, that consisted of numerous centers of power. There was the French state, there was the British state, there was the Prussian state, there was the Bavarian state, there was the Austro-Hungarian state, there was the Italian state once it became unified at the end of the 19th century. There was the Dutch state, there was the Belgian state, and so on and so forth, the Swedish, the Norwegians, the Danes, all of which had their own states. And that essentially created a multipolar system of power. Meaning many poles that
wielded force. And it was remarkably stable in that that multiplicity of power centers allowed for a great deal of flexibility. Essentially what took place and what maintained the peace throughout the 19th century were shifting alliances between these various forces, such that when one threatened to become a little bit too powerful, or perhaps threaten one of its neighbors, the neighboring country could call upon other members of the European community to form alliances to counterbalance against the power that was becoming more worrisome. And these alliances shifted on a regular basis, allowing for a great deal of flexibility and preventing any major war between powers within Europe. And since Europe controlled much of the rest of the world, therefore meant that the rest of the world was largely peaceful as well. We'll talk about that in the political economy context a little bit more later on. One of the prominent features, of course, of the 19th century is that Britain was undoubtedly the dominant power globally, and consequently facilitated that stability to a considerable extent. Suffice it to say, however, that it was relatively stable. And one of the worries that Europeans had is that this multipolar system of states could evolve into a bipolar arrangement. And the understanding at the time was that a bipolar arrangement would inherently be less stable. A bipolar arrangement is essentially one in which there are two sides, in which there are two power centers that are balanced against each other. And it was considered unstable by virtue of the fact that as soon as one power got the upper hand, or was perceived to have gotten the upper hand, it would have a strong motivation to take advantage of that position in order to attack its neighbors. In other words, it was far less stable. In a multipolar system, a growth by one power could be counterbalanced. In a bipolar system, it could not. Now, how did such a bipolar system emerge? Well, the main problem was Germany. And the main problem was Germany insofar as that Germany constitutes the largest ethnic group within Europe. It's right at the center of Europe. And consequently, powers throughout the history of Europe had always been worried about a unified German population under the control of a single state. Such a state would be too powerful for its neighbors to counterbalance against, defend themselves against. And consequently, the ruling elites or the ruling families of Western Europe continuously throughout the history of medieval Europe manipulated things in such a way as to make sure that that never happened. That Bavaria was always hostile to Prussia, that Prussia was always in conflict with various other principalities and so on in Germany to prevent that unification. There were attempts to unify Germany that took place in the 19th century, primarily through the attempts to create a German parliament in Berlin. Actually, the original parliament was supposed to be in Frankfurt. And to unify Germany as a democratic set of states under a federalist system. That effort reached its high point in 1848, but was ultimately defeated. Germany thus became unified not under a democratic system of government, but rather because one of the power centers within Germany became more powerful, and that was Prussia. Prussia at the time, in the latter half of the 19th century, was governed by Kaiser Wilhelm I. And Kaiser Wilhelm I, by the 1860s, was already a very old man, was not particularly interested in politics, and insofar as that there's something that is unique about him, it is the fact that he granted the power to deal with most of the business of governing Prussia to his chancellor, a fellow by the name of Otto von Bismarck. Otto von Bismarck's name you probably have heard before. The Iron Chancellor, as he became known. He became known as the Iron Chancellor because he indeed was pretty authoritarian in terms of his style of rule, and was a master manipulator of politics. But the more important thing about him was that he understood a couple of things. One of which was that Prussia was very quickly in the process of becoming a colony of Great Britain. In large part because Prussia is the region of Germany that is most productive in terms of being able to grow grain. And its ruling elites, the Junkers, governed over enormous estates that did just that, produce enormous amounts of grain. And almost all of that grain was exported to Great Britain, the workshop of the world throughout the 19th century, and almost everything that these elites consumed was imported from Great Britain because Great Britain was producing the best manufactured goods. So while it was not a direct colony, it was certainly falling into that trap. And he recognized that in order to avoid that trap, Germany would have to industrialize, would have to develop, would have to imitate what had already happened in Great Britain and in France to a certain extent. But in order to do that, they needed a larger territory and a larger market than Prussia itself. In other words, they needed German unification. And consequently, Otto von Bismarck initiated a series of 3 conflicts that essentially allowed Prussia to dominate all of Germany. The first was a brief war with Denmark, in which they took the territory of Schleswig-Holstein. You don't have to remember all these names. It's the northernmost region of Germany. The second war was a war against Austria-Hungary, in which they gained domination over Bavaria, which previously had closer ties to Austria-Hungary. And the final was the Franco-Prussian War, in which they drove French forces out of the Rhineland and took control of the regions east as well as west of the Rhine and the Mosel Valley. Essentially, they unified what is today the territory that is today Germany. One of the things that Bismarck, who was generally credited as being a master statesman and one of the founders of the realist school of international relations, recognized, however, was the problem that is posed by what in international relations terms are often called security dilemmas. Security dilemmas, we talked about briefly in the first class, are basically refer to the notion that security and the quest for security is inherently a zero-sum game. In other words, any gain in security by one actor is a loss of security by others. As one power becomes more powerful, it becomes more secure. But its greater power becomes a threat to its neighbors, which therefore become less secure. And if you add the losses and gains up, they add up to 0. And security dilemmas were particularly problematic in Bismarck's view in Germany's situation. Because if Germany became too powerful, it would become a worry to its immediate neighbors. And its immediate neighbors included France, Great Britain, and Russia. And France and Great Britain are on one side of Germany, and Russia is on the other side of Germany. And consequently, Bismarck recognized that insofar as Germany became too powerful, it would force an alliance between these 3 different powers, and that in turn would make Germany extremely vulnerable. Because if a conflict broke out, it would be a 2-front war in which Germany would have to divide its forces between the East and the West, and that would make it extremely vulnerable. And therefore, he was determined to make sure that Germany would not become a threat to its neighbors. And one of the ways of avoiding becoming a threat to its neighbors is to forswear any attempts to create broader alliances with other powers that would be natural allies for Germany. And the most natural ally for Germany in that regard was Austria-Hungary. Austria was governed by German elites. Most of the territory spoke German and had close affinities to Germany, and in that sense it formed almost a natural alliance. But that alliance would immediately be a worry to the other European powers. And consequently, Bismarck did not form such an alliance. Unfortunately, in the early 1870s, Kaiser Wilhelm I died. He was briefly replaced by his son, who was feeble himself and died a couple of years later, and then was replaced by Kaiser Wilhelm II, a much younger monarch and a much more ambitious monarch. And the first thing that Wilhelm II did was fire Otto von Bismarck. And the second thing that he did is form an alliance with Austria-Hungary. And the upshot of that is that it had exactly the effect that Bismarck feared. In other words, that it turned into an alliance system around Germany, including Austria-Hungary and eventually the Ottoman Empire, and that in turn forced a separate alliance system in opposition. So the Central Powers became the Triple Alliance, and the countervailing alliance was called the Triple Entente, consisting of Russia, France, and Great Britain. That bipolar system very quickly became extremely tense. In other words, both sides were worried that the other side might gain the upper hand and take advantage of having the upper hand by launching a preemptive strike against their enemies. So much so that both sides, by the beginning of the 20th century, made it clear that any act of mobilization, in other words, any attempt to mobilize their military, would be considered an act of war, even if no shots were fired and no border was crossed. Essentially because of the perception that if one side gained even a day's advantage in mobilizing their forces, that could be enough to be decisive in an actual war. So the tensions were extremely high. And it's in that context that in 1914, the Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated in a city in Serbia. The Archduke Ferdinand was the person who was in line to inherit the Austro-Hungarian throne, so he was a very important figure in Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary blamed the assassination on Russia, and therefore declared war on Russia. Russia then declared war on Austria-Hungary and Germany on Russia, and Great Britain and France declared war on Germany and Austria-Hungary as well, and there you have the First World War. Now, I don't want to talk about the First World War too much. The only thing I want to say about it is that it was an enormously bloody conflict. An enormously bloody conflict that nobody really anticipated. A number of historians, most notably Gabriel Kokol, have looked at the history of World War I, and Gabriel Kokol comes to the conclusion that it is a good illustration of the extent to which ruling elites delude themselves. In other words, the impression on all sides was that this was going to be a quick war. It started in August of 1914, and all sides predicted that it would be over and that they would be victorious by Christmas of that year. As most of you know, it didn't turn out that way. And one reason that it didn't turn out that way is because, unlike the Franco-Prussian War, which all powers assumed it would be like, the First World War was a much more industrial scale war. And that meant that between the time of 1870 and 1914, there was considerable advancements in terms of weapons, in particular in terms of guns, in terms of planes, in terms of tanks, and so on and so forth. The upshot of that is that the kind of confined battles that took place previously turned into trench warfare. Trench warfare in which hundreds of thousands, if not millions of soldiers died just to push the battle lines a couple of hundred yards one way or a couple of hundred yards the other way. In that war, Germany made relatively steady progress, both on the Western and the Eastern Front. The Eastern Front, that steady progress eventually undermined the control that the Russian emperors, the Russian czars, had over Russia. In other words, it led to the Russian Revolution. And after the Russian Revolution, the Russians pulled out of the First World War, and that in turn allowed Germany to concentrate its forces on the Western Front and pushed further and further into French territory. Basically in 1918, in the summer of 1918, put on a final push to defeat the French, to capture Paris. During that final push, they were close enough to shell the city of Paris, meaning that they were only maybe 20 or 30 kilometers outside of Paris, but they failed to take Paris. And at that point, General Ludendorff, the commander of the German forces, sent a telegram back to Kaiser Wilhelm II saying, "We have to sue for peace. We're done." That came as a shock to Germany. It came to a shock to the Kaiser. But the reason for it was that basically General Ludendorff, who was very familiar with warfare, recognized that Germany had kind of overextended itself. That had it defeated the French and had it captured Paris, the war would have been over and they would have been victorious, but since it did not, its battle lines was too long to keep resupplying its military. And furthermore, it became considerably vulnerable. In other words, he recognized that they could not hold their positions, that they used all their resources, and that it was inevitable that they would be pushed back out of French territory and eventually into German territory, and eventually Germany would be German territory would be captured. And thus it was perfectly reasonable for him to say, let's negotiate now while we still hold lots of French territory, rather than wait until they're on our doorstep to negotiate when we're in a much weaker position. The problem that he faced, however, is that one of the reasons why they were not successful in defeating the French was because the French were being backed by the Americans. And the Americans had entered the war in 1917 on certain conditions that were outlined by Woodrow Wilson, the president of the United States at the time, who made his speech about 14 points that justified American entry into the war, and argued that the United States would enter the war only if the war was going to be a war to end all wars. In other words, there would not be subsequent wars. And that's certainly a rather tall project, but he had a number of methods by which he was going to achieve that. And all of those relate to a considerable extent to what we talked about previously, which is the notion of a democratic peace theory. The notion that democracies don't make war against each other. And that the reason that the war broke out in Europe was because some of the European powers weren't democratic. The countries that weren't democratic at the time were Germany, which was still under the monarchy, and Austria-Hungary. And therefore, in response to the request for a ceasefire and the negotiated peace, Woodrow Wilson basically said, we will not negotiate until the Kaiser abdicates from his throne. And Germany becomes democratic. And furthermore, he had a number of other things that he wanted to impose as a means to make sure that Europe never become an arena of war again. Among them were the notion of the League of Nations, that international relations should henceforth be governed not by conflicts between states, but by, as he put it, open covenants, openly arrived at. Secret diplomacy and intrigue and so on would be replaced by open institutions in which states could settle their differences peacefully, and a system of collective security based on those international institutions that would be able to restrain any potential aggressor in the international system by committing all of the members of the League of Nations to come to the defense of any country that was attacked by another member of the international community. I don't want to go into too much detail on all of that. Suffice it to say, however, that Wilson was pretty successful in imposing a large portion of his project onto the peace settlement that emerged. The peace settlement that emerged was the Treaty of Versailles, and the Treaty of Versailles, of course, included provisions to create a democracy in Germany, the Weimar Republic that was established in Germany in 1918. It also created the League of Nations, but it had certain other features that run counter to the project that Wilson was trying to accomplish. In particular, Wilson was keen that whatever settlement emerged out of this was one that was agreed on and that seemed legitimate. And that meant that there could be no victor's justice. And that in turn meant that Germany and France and so on should settle their differences and should move forward from that. That certainly would have been required in order to have peaceful relations between France and Germany subsequently, but the British and the French were not at all convinced of this. The British and the French didn't view politics, international politics, through the lens of liberalism, but rather viewed it through the lens of realism. And from their point of view, what was important was not the setting up of international institutions or democracy in Germany. Neither of those would guarantee their security. What would guarantee their security is that Germany never be allowed to become powerful enough to threaten their borders. Now, those two goals therefore run counter to each other. How did the French and the British make sure that Germany would never be powerful enough to threaten them again? Well, the first thing that they did is that they declared, as the Versailles Treaty does, that Germany was the aggressor in the First World War, and therefore had to pay for all the damages caused by the First World War. Now, as my previous comments might have indicated, who started the First World War is a pretty dubious proposition to determine. In other words, it started with the assassination of an archduke that led to a declaration of wars back and forth. It's not at all clear that Germany was the aggressor in that. It was simply dragged into it by virtue of the fact of having allied itself with Austria-Hungary that felt that it had been attacked by Russia in that assassination. Nonetheless, Germany was forced to pay reparations, and since it was basically broke, which is why it ended the war to begin with, and therefore not able to pay those reparations, the French were given access to a large tract of German territory, the industrial heartland of Germany, to administer themselves in order to remove the reparations from that territory. Furthermore, the German state was dismantled to a considerable extent, giving up territory to Czechoslovakia as well as to Poland, the Polish corridor, and so on. All of which was rather brutal for Germany. Now, if you want a democracy in a place like Germany to be successful, what's the prerequisite for a functioning democracy? Well, I would say the best and most important prerequisite for a functioning democracy is a functioning economy. If the economy doesn't function, chances are the political system won't function. If you want to make sure that Germany is never in a position to attack you again, what's the best way of making sure of that? Cripple the economy. In other words, Germany got the democracy and a crippled economy. And that the two weren't going to work well together should have been pretty obvious to everyone involved. And indeed was pretty obvious to some observers, like Lord Keynes, that denounced the Treaty of Versailles as creating an extremely unstable situation and sowing the seeds of the next major conflict. Suffice it to say, however, that Germany ultimately did have major problems maintaining its democracy. It ultimately descended into the rule of the Nazis, which then led to World War II. Just want to briefly explore one other component of that, and that is that to understand the 20th century and to understand the Second World War, you also have to understand what resulted from the First World War and what brought about the Second. And one important characteristic in that regard, or one important development in that regard, was the Great Depression. The Great Depression began in the United States, and that indeed began in the United States long before the 1929 stock market crash. The stock market crash was to a large extent a result of the Great Depression rather than the cause of it. The Great Depression, and again, we could spend hours talking about the Great Depression. I don't intend to do so. The easiest way to summarize what happened in the Great Depression is that the Great Depression was a problem that was created not by the failure of the capitalist system to function, but rather by its enormous success. Its enormous success, in particular in the United States. The United States had begun its process of capitalist industrialization in the 1860s. By 1900, had bypassed Great Britain as the #1 producer on the planet, roughly the same time that Germany also bypassed Britain as a bigger producer of industrial goods than Great Britain. And had proceeded from that in large part because of the enormous demand that the First World War created for American exports and so on. And that led to the development of huge corporations within the United States. These huge corporations revolutionized the means of production. Industrialists like Henry Ford and so on created technological systems, the assembly lines and so on and so forth, that were able to crank out enormous amounts of products, in this case cars, using relatively little labor. And since they were always in competition with each other, these corporations constantly had to upgrade their means of production, and upgrading their means of production inherently meant making them more efficient, and making them more efficient inherently means producing more goods using less and less labor. And what happens in an environment where there is less and less demand for labor, and labor is, or the price of labor is determined by the market for labor. Well, if there's less demand and equal supply or more supply, the price of labor continues to go down. And essentially, what that creates is a problem that Karl Marx had drawn attention to back in the 1860s, and that is that eventually it leads to crisis. It leads to a crisis in which the capitalist economy is cranking out more and more goods, but has fewer and fewer consumers able to buy anything, because their reward for their labor is basically subsistence level. Essentially what that means is that what emerged in the Great Depression was a period of deflation. As demand, the ability of people to consume dropped, prices dropped. As prices dropped, the ability of enterprises to make profits also dropped. And as their profits dropped, more and more companies were going bankrupt. As companies were going bankrupt, more people were thrown into unemployment. As they were thrown into unemployment, the aggregate demand went further down. In other words, it was a self-reinforcing downward spiral. The upshot of that was that by 1929, it led to a stock market crash. And that stock market crash led to the bankruptcy of numerous banks. And that, in turn, spread the depression from the United States to many other parts of the world. The United States, by that point, was the biggest creditor on the planet. And that meant that the depression very quickly had effects in Europe, and had effects in particular among the biggest borrowers in Europe. And guess who was the biggest borrower in Europe from the United States? Germany. Germany, because of its need for reconstruction and so on. And that meant essentially that Germany was plunged into the Great Depression, and in fact was affected by it to a greater extent than any other country, including the United States. It had higher unemployment rates and so on. And that, in turn, undermined the democratic system of government, gave rise to the Nazis that won the 1933 elections, and led to Hitler being declared the Chancellor. and that in turn led to World War II. World War II that began with the German government under Adolf Hitler initially claiming that they merely wanted to correct the problems of the Versailles Treaty by retaking the Rhineland, which he did fairly early on, subsequently retaking the Sudetenland, the territory that was ceded to Czechoslovakia, that's largely populated by Germans, and subsequently trying to gain control over the Polish corridor, which was also removed from German territory through the Versailles Treaty. The attitude of many of the other countries in the region was essentially, he's only taking back what was really all along his. In other words, they appeased the forces of Hitler, and one reason for that is that they were all mired in the Depression themselves. And the interesting thing about all of this is that Germany was not only the hardest hit by the Depression, but also the first to emerge out of the Depression. And it became the first to emerge out of the Depression because of the policies adopted by the Nazis, and policies that were subsequently imitated by many of the other countries. How did the Nazis do that? Well, basically, what Hitler did was that he started printing up money, and that he used that money to hire people, unemployed people, and put them to work building the Autobahn, and expanding the railroad network, and building various other forms of infrastructure, and eventually building more and more arms. And that put money in people's pockets, and that meant that people could consume things again. And that in turn meant that companies started to do business again. And therefore Germany within the year of 1933, by the beginning of 1934, went from an unemployment rate of over 30% to virtually full employment by 1934. And that in turn meant that it was a country that was very interesting to do business with. And therefore Europeans, Americans, and so on flocked to Germany to do business with Germany, to profit from that reconstruction. And the other countries were not about to rock that boat, and therefore were more inclined to appease Germany. Of course, as we now know, Germany's goal, or Hitler's goal, was not simply to recapture territory that was lost during World War I. Instead, he went well beyond that to create the 1,000-year Reich and so on and so forth. We don't need to talk too much about that. Suffice it to say that World War II was, again, very, very different from its predecessors. World War I in this regard, as I pointed out, was an industrial scale war that had unprecedented casualties. However, it was still a war that fit the overall pattern of wars as they existed for centuries before. And that overall pattern is that in wars up to and prior to World War I, 9 out of 10 casualties in those wars were soldiers. Civilian casualties were extremely rare. Battles took place on battlefields between battling armies, and the majority of casualties were those that were involved in those battles. The populations outside of that, the civilian populations, for the most part were only affected insofar as it became harder to find groceries and things along those lines, and the taxes certainly went up to pay for the wars. In that regard, it was still a fairly typical conflict. World War II reversed all of that. In World War II, 9 out of 10 casualties, and in every war since that time, by the way, 9 out of 10 of the casualties in modern wars since the Second World War have been civilians. And the reason for that is that World War II became a total war. A total war. And let me briefly explain what is meant by that. Wars, as they had been fought in Europe and elsewhere throughout most of the Middle Ages and the centuries prior to the 20th century, were for the most part subject to certain kinds of regulations, generally articulated as just war theory. If you're interested in just war theory, there's extensive writings on that subject, and we'll talk about it in a bit more detail later on. But one of the chief requirements of just war theory is the notion of discrimination. And the notion of discrimination is that those involved in a war have to do their utmost to make sure that they attack only relevant military targets, and that they spare any civilians and any civilian installations from destruction. Now, that began to change during the First World War, in that in the First World War, what became fairly evident is that the war was not simply between the armies of Germany and the armies of France and Britain and so on and so forth, but that the ability of these armies to operate depended to a considerable extent on what had happened behind the battle lines, on the ability to supply those armies and so on and so forth. The problem in World War I, as far as that goes, was that there wasn't really much that either side could do about what went on behind the battle lines. they didn't have advanced planes. Planes were certainly operative in the First World War, but for the most part, those planes engaged in dogfights with each other. In other words, they tried to shoot each other down, and to a limited extent, they became involved in dropping a few bombs on battlefields. But they weren't big enough to carry major payloads, and therefore to become decisive in launching attacks against targets behind battle lines. In World War II, that all changed. And it changed in large part because of the technological changes, in particular with regard to aircrafts. Both sides developed aircrafts that were capable of carrying much heavier payloads, including bombs. And Germany was certainly the first to make use of that. They made use of that rather notoriously in their intervention in the Spanish Civil War, in which they carpet bombed the city of Guernica, something that is memorialized in the painting Guernica by Pablo Picasso. One of the most haunting images that I'm sure you've probably seen. If you haven't, just type the name into Google and it will very quickly pop up. They also made use of carpet bombing in order to defeat the Dutch and to take over Dutch territory, in particular of the city of Rotterdam. They also used carpet bombing or extensive bombing in the Blitz attacks on Great Britain. But by far, the largest attacks using air power were launched by the Allies against Germany and later against Japan. Such that, by the end of the war, 90% of all German cities were completely reduced to rubble. And that process of carpet bombing started initially with the rejection on the part of Western powers of the idea of using indiscriminate air power. The British and the Americans in particular argued that they would engage in using air power only for surgical strikes, only to hit specific targets like munitions factories. And in fact, they functioned on the basis of what they call a bottleneck theory. In other words, the idea that they could cripple the German war machine by taking out certain important key installations. The first target selected for that reason was a ball bearings plant that apparently was the only place in Germany that produced ball bearings. And ball bearings are necessary for everything from aircraft engines to tank engines to machine guns and so on and so forth. And therefore the idea is you take out the ball bearings plant and suddenly you cripple the ability of Germany to produce all of these kinds of goods. They did take it out. It didn't work very well. The Germans very quickly reestablished other ball bearings plants and put them into secret locations so they couldn't be bombed again, and thus it didn't work all that well. The British were always less reluctant about the indiscriminate use of bombs, in part because of their experience during the Blitz. And consequently, the Americans that were a little squeamish about this came up with a division of labor between the British and the French, where the British would bomb at night. Can't engage in much in the way of surgical strikes at night, and the Americans would bomb during the day. But even then, even with their best efforts of being surgical, if that indeed was their intention, the nature of warfare had changed. Basically, as Robert McNamara, who was one of the planners he became later the Secretary of State for the United States and was involved in the planning of the air attacks both in Germany and in Japan during the Second World War, explained, essentially, in order to have a statistically significant assurance that you could take out a specific target, like a factory in a city like Hamburg, you had to drop basically 10,000 bombs to make sure that at least one of them hit that target. That was bombing at relatively low altitudes. What they very quickly discovered is that if they bombed at low altitudes that allowed a fair amount of precision, they also stood a good chance of being shot down. And the only way to avoid that is to go much higher. And the higher you went, the less accurate you got. And of course, as you can imagine, things like railroad tracks, which also were prominent targets, and factories, were inherently located in the center of cities. And that meant that one bomb might strike the target, and the other 9,999 would strike the immediate vicinity, which were, for the most part, civilian areas. By the end of the Second World War, however, even that notion that, well, there's collateral damage involved and we can't help that, basically was abandoned even by the Americans. And thus, the bombing of cities like Hamburg and Dresden was intentionally designed to burn down the entire city. In large part because they used not only explosive devices, but also incendiary devices, with the very clear intention of creating self-sustaining firestorms in the core of cities that would destroy entire cities. If you're interested in that, one of the best accounts of the attack of the bombing on the city of Dresden
was written by a very well-known author that survived the bombing of Dresden as a prisoner of war in Dresden. And his name is Kurt Vonnegut Jr. And the name of the book is Slaughterhouse 5, which was the location of the basement that he hid out in during the carpet bombing of Dresden, and in which he survived. The same thing was, of course, true in Tokyo and in Japan more generally. As the United States turned its attention to Japan, it likewise made extensive use of air power. And that extensive use of air power was even more destructive in the environment of Japan. Why? Because most European cities, including most German cities, are primarily constructed out of concrete and brick and things along those lines. Japanese cities were almost exclusively built from wood and paper and things along those lines. In other words, much more flammable material. And that meant creating a firestorm that could destroy an entire city was all that much easier. And again, for those of you that are interested in that, a very good documentary to watch is the one that's on Robert McNamara. It's called The Fog of War. It is an extensive interview with him in which he explores his role both in the First World War and subsequently in the Vietnam War. Makes for very good entertainment as well as education. So I strongly recommend that you take a look at that. In the Japanese context, it of course also meant the dropping of the atomic bomb. And the atomic bomb is a good place to start our discussion of the Cold War. Why? Well, the official explanation of the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki is that the Americans were desperate to avoid losing large numbers of casualties to an actual occupation of Japan. The basic idea was that if the Americans had to occupy Japan and Japan resisted tooth and nail, it would kill lots of Japanese and it would also kill lots of Americans. And that the easiest way to bring the war to an end was to drop the nuclear weapons and force a quick surrender. And it's probably true that those that made the decision to drop the bombs didn't really think that the decision to drop the bombs was all that morally significant. They'd already carpet bombed Tokyo and created a firestorm that destroyed the entire city and much of its population. And most other cities in Japan likewise. In fact, Nagasaki and Hiroshima were the two only cities that had not been extensively bombed by the time that the atomic bombs were dropped. Now, if you're going to destroy entire cities, does it really make much difference whether you drop 10,000 bombs on a city or whether you drop just one, if the consequence is the same? Well, to the decision makers, probably it made no difference at all, other than that one was much more spectacular. And of course, they didn't have much of an understanding of the radiation and the threat that that would pose subsequently. That came later. Another reason why Nagasaki and Hiroshima were chosen is precisely because they hadn't been previously bombed. And one of the things that the Americans were certainly very interested in is what kind of an effect these weapons would have on a place. Now, if they had dropped those bombs on Tokyo, would that have helped them understand the power of nuclear weapons? Well, Tokyo was already destroyed, and it would have been very difficult to distinguish between the destruction wielded by that was a result of the atomic weapons and the destruction that had taken place previously. They needed a virgin territory in which to test that, and Hiroshima and Nagasaki recommended themselves from that point of view. It resulted in the surrender of the Japanese forces. However, as numerous historians have demonstrated since, the Japanese were already exploring means of surrendering, of bringing conflict to the end. So it was quite clearly not the motivation of the Americans to bring the war to an end, since there was already ample evidence that the Japanese were searching for some means of bringing that conflict to an end. So why did they drop the bombs? Well, the most convincing consensus in that regard is that the bombs were dropped not in order to impress the Japanese, but rather in order to impress the Russians. And that's somewhat unique, since the Russians were allied with the United States and were allied with Great Britain. And indeed, the Soviets bore the brunt of the cost of defeating Nazi Germany. Russia lost over 25 million lives in the Second World War. It had much of its territory occupied by the Nazis. It clearly broke the back of the Nazi war machine long before the attacks on the invasion of D-Day. The Americans and the British were simply mopping up what the Soviets had already considerably degraded. So how does it make any sense that they were suddenly focused on the Russians?
Well, to make sense of that, we have to understand that the Russians were, of course, governed by a communist government. And that communist government had seized power in 1917 and had declared its intention in 1917 to be the vanguard of a world revolution. A world revolution that would rid the whole planet of the scourge of capitalism, that would overthrow and help to overthrow capitalist countries around the world, and most notably, of course, in the capitalist heartlands of the United States and Great Britain and Germany and places like that. And that meant that the other countries in Western Europe in particular, and in North America, were rather worried about the Russian Revolution, and almost immediately took measures to try to reverse it. In other words, they backed a counter-revolution. They backed the forces that had supported the Tsar in their attempts to retake Moscow, which ultimately failed. The only thing that brought Russia and Great Britain and the United States together was their mutual fear of Germany and Japan. They had little or else in common in terms of their ideology, in terms of their outlook, in terms of their long-term geostrategic goals. And that meant that to most of those that were involved in the planning of the war, it was fairly evident that the moment that that potent enemy was defeated, that alliance would break down. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, until that enemy is no longer around. Then the enemy of my enemy is no longer necessarily my friend, especially if he previously was my enemy. In that regard, pretty much everyone could have predicted the rise of the Cold War. Nonetheless, the Cold War emerged a little bit more slowly and began to emerge, in particular in Germany. In Germany, the Allies that had cooperated to defeat Germany occupied German territory, the Russians from the east, the Western powers from the west. And they met sort of right in the center of Germany and decided, therefore, at the Yalta Conference, that they would occupy the regions that they liberated from Nazi rule and would strive to achieve three basic goals. And those goals were to denazify Germany, to demilitarize Germany, and to democratize Germany. Once they'd achieved those goals, they would then withdraw their forces, reunify the territories, and allow Germany to govern itself. Well, that arrangement very quickly created many problems. And among those problems were, first and foremost, the denazification. Denazification was not a problem for the Russians. It was not a problem for the Russians, A, because the Russians were much more brutal in their treatment of Germans. Indeed, at the Yalta Conference, apparently, when this question came up, Stalin said, this isn't the problem. The answer is obvious. So when we take over Germany, we round up the top 10,000 Nazi officials, we march them out in the field, and we mow them down with machine guns, and that's the end of it. And then we can take off from there. And Churchill, and in particular Roosevelt, apparently went, whoa, 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 we can't do that, that's barbaric. What we'll do instead is that we'll write a set of laws, and then we'll create courts, and then we'll try those Nazi criminals in accordance to the laws that we've just written up, and then we'll take them out in the field and shoot them down with machine guns. Not quite like that, but essentially you get the general picture. In large part, the Nuremberg trials and the Tokyo trials were considered by those that were in front of those trials a charade. And for some legitimate reasons. Almost every legal system on the planet has provisions against ex post facto law. Ex post facto law means that you can't declare something that's already happened illegal and then convict somebody in accordance to the law that you just passed. And basically, there were no international laws that were in place prior to World War II, and therefore, whatever Nuremberg laws were written up were in effect ex post facto laws. That's a less important factor. What's more important is that the Russians didn't have much problems with denazification, in large part because German military officials were well aware of the fate that they would be would meet them if they were captured by the Russians. Very few Germans made it out of Russian prisoner of war camps. Most of them starved to death in Russia, and consequently, they did whatever they could to escape from the Russians and preferred to surrender to the British or the Americans, where they had much better survival chances. And that meant essentially there wasn't much of a denazification problem left in the eastern regions that the Russians controlled. And furthermore, many of the center and left-wing politicians that had functioned in Germany prior to the takeover of the Nazis, in order to escape from concentration camps, escaped from Germany, left Germany, and who would have welcomed members of the German Communist Party and the German Socialist Party in the period leading up to World War I? Would the Americans have been very keen to accept German communists? Would the British have been? Of course not. The countries that were willing to accept them were primarily the Soviet Union and to a lesser extent Sweden. And that meant essentially that the Russians already had a cadre of sympathetic politicians that they could bring back into East Germany and put into positions of power, thus accomplishing the denazification. On the Allied side, on the American and British side, however, the problem was much more profound. If they were going to be serious about denazification, they would have to prevent anyone that was involved in the Nazi regime from coming to power. Who would have been left to take power if they excluded all of those that had either been Nazis or collaborators with the Nazis? Well, the only ones that didn't collaborate with the Nazis were the members of the Communist Party and the Socialist Party. And the Americans and the British weren't about to put those folks into power. And that meant that they immediately faced the problem of how to deal with the Western sector and how to deal with denazification. The upshot of that is that the first step that they introduced was that they had a list of 10,000 Nazi officials that were supposed to be tried. Within a year of the occupation, all but 9,000 of them found themselves back in their old jobs. In other words, what they instituted was a different way of calculating responsibility. One of which, and probably one of the most important, was that they declared that anyone that worked in the private sector would not be held responsible for what happened during the Third Reich. And that meant that all of the corporate executives and so on in the big German firms were let off the hook. Now that might seem reasonable. Why would private people in business be held to account for the actions of their government? Except that, of course, fascism, as defined by Mussolini, was a system in which you could not fit a cigarette paper between corporate and state power. In other words, where corporate power and state power became one and the same thing. And that essentially meant that the big corporations in Germany were absolutely complicit in the crimes of the Nazis. Not only in terms of the war production that helped the Nazi war machine to gain territory, but even in the exploitation of slave labor in concentration camps. All the big German firms made extensive use of that. And to let them off the hook, therefore, was a considerable blow to those that expected a thorough denazification in West Germany. Secondly, they introduced the notion of collective guilt. The notion of collective guilt was essentially a statement that the German nation was collectively guilty of the crimes of the Nazis, and if they were collectively guilty, that kind of meant that no one was more responsible than anyone else, and essentially allowed them to kind of sweep those matters under the carpet. So the denazification was shortchanged to a considerable extent. But what also began to happen is that, the aim of the occupation forces was initially to reunify Germany. The Russians, by all indication, were very keen on a reunification of Germany, and were keen on a reunification of Germany in large part because they assumed, for good reason, that a reunified, denazified, democratized Germany would be communist Germany. In other words, would join the Eastern powers. And the Western powers were equally convinced that that would likely be the case. And therefore, it was the Western powers that first introduced a separate currency in their occupation zones, thereby essentially severing the economies of the two regions. The Russians followed suit. Then the Germans instituted the Western powers instituted a constitution for the Western regions called the Basic Law, not a constitution because it wasn't supposed to become a constitution until the country was eventually reunified. And thus the Russians followed suit, and basically what emerged was two separate states. Those two separate states were the beginnings of the Cold War. The beginnings of the Cold War, in that the Cold War involved both sides attempting to stabilize Europe, as much of Europe as possible, within their alliance system. Now, stabilizing Western Europe was a tall order. Western Europe, and in particular West Germany, had been completely destroyed. And therefore, in order to stabilize it, in order to make it less vulnerable to communist subversion and so on and so forth, the Western powers had to reconstruct it as rapidly as possible. And in that sense, took a very different attitude toward West Germany than they took toward Germany at the end of the First World War. Instead of Germany being forced to pay reparations, Germany would benefit from the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan was essentially a plan whereby the Americans channeled enormous amounts of credit into Western Europe, and in particular into Germany, to help help the Germans recover their economy. The Americans were, of course, in an ideal position to do so. The United States emerged from the Second World War as clearly the dominant power on the planet. It controlled 50% of all industrial productions on the planet, produced more than 50% of the oil on the planet, produced more than 50% of the iron and steel on the planet. In other words, it was left in the most powerful position ever in its history, at the same time that all of its international competitors had destroyed themselves. And thus, it was in a position to be relatively generous. The Soviet Union, by contrast, was not in a position to be particularly generous. It had lost 25 million people, had much of its industrial heartland occupied by the Nazis and subsequently destroyed, and consequently, rather than being able to grant generous credits to East Germany, instead did the exact opposite. It pretty much carried off everything that they could carry off and moved it to Russia, disassembling entire factories and reassembling them in Russia. The modern upshot of that is that if any of you guys ever watched World War II movies, one of the things that you often saw were the German soldiers riding around on motorcycles with sidecars, those old BMWs with their boxer twin engines. Well, you can still buy exact replicas of those motorcycles with their sidecars without any technical changes whatsoever since the Second World War, and they're now made in Russia. And they're made in the same factory that made them in Germany, that was moved after the war from East Germany to Russia. An illustration of the different dynamics. And that basically meant that East Germany became relatively poor. It was already the poorer region of Germany to begin with, but it became even poorer after the partition of Germany, while West Germany very quickly developed and became kind of a showplace for what capitalism could do. The Americans faced similar kinds of problems in other parts of Europe and in other parts of the world, indeed. Most of the resistance to the Nazi forces, to the fascist forces, both in Asia and in Europe, were associated with communist or socialist parties. And essentially the main problem that the Americans faced was how to keep those people out of power. And in that sense, they threw their support, for example, behind the Greek military that had collaborated with Nazi Germany, rather than with the Greek resistance movement that had fought against them in the aftermath of the Second World War. The same thing was to a large extent true of China, where they threw their support behind Chiang Kai-shek, who had done little or nothing to defeat Nazi Germany, Japan, and ignored completely the much more powerful forces of Mao Zedong that had borne the brunt of driving the Japanese out of Chinese territory. The same thing was to a large extent true of Korea. Suffice it to say that the end of the Second World War was the beginning of the Cold War, which eventually took the form of the organization of NATO, the North American Treaty Organization, which brought together the various Western powers under the dominance of the United States, and the Warsaw Pact that was organized by the Soviet Union to counter the influence of NATO, or to protect the Eastern countries. Now, in terms of exploring the Cold War, rather than go through all the historical complications, the best way to do so, I think, is the way that's outlined in your text, and it is to look at it through the 4 dimensions of the Cold War that are outlined. And those 4 dimensions are the ideological dimension, the geopolitical dimension, the international dimension, and the strategic dimension. And I won't get through all of those today because I promised I'd let you out a little bit earlier, but in the next 5 minutes or so, I'm going to briefly talk about the ideological dimension of the Cold War. The ideological dimension obviously refers to the clash of conflicting ideologies. The ideology of communism and socialism on the one hand, and the ideology of liberal market capitalism, or capitalism and liberal democracy on the other. Essentially, both tried to demonstrate that they could deliver the goods to their populations to a greater extent than the other in order to increase their legitimacy and increase their power. Now, it is, of course, tempting, given our historical position today, to assume that the Russians would never win this kind of ideological war. That communism, since it obviously failed, since the Soviet Union obviously fell apart, could not possibly compete effectively with Western capitalist states. But I think that's a gross oversimplification, and not by virtue of the fact that I like communism or that I like Stalin or Lenin or anything of that sort, but rather that if you look at the history of the Soviet Union from a neutral perspective, you have to be to some extent impressed with the successes that they had. The first thing that should be noted is, of course, that the communist system was established on the basis of the teachings of Karl Marx. And Karl Marx, as I think I've noted before, was not so much a critic of capitalism. In fact, he was a great fan of capitalism. He thought that capitalism was the great locomotive of history because it, more than any other system, revolutionizes the means of production and therefore creates the circumstances under which a liberation of humans from the necessity of exploitation and work can be realized. But it can only be realized if the institutions of capitalism are changed to institutions of socialism, in which the productive forces are used in the interest of the entire population and not just in the interest of the profit motives of those that own those enterprises. Now, having said that, it should be fairly obvious that the last place on the planet where Karl Marx would have expected a communist revolution would have been in the Soviet Union. Russia, at the time of the Russian Revolution, was predominantly a feudal society, not a capitalist society. They had no industry or very little industry. More than 90% of the population were peasants, and most of the ruling class were feudal lords. Capitalism hadn't even begun to have an impact on Russia. So why did a Russian Revolution take place there? Probably the best answer was offered by Vladimir Lenin. Vladimir Lenin, in his extrapolations of Marxist theory or his further development of Marxist theory, in particular his book The State and Revolution and his book on imperialism, argued that Marx was wrong about one thing. Marx tended to look at capitalism as a national system, whereas in fact capitalism is an international system, is a global system. And if it is a global system that became global largely through its ties to imperialism and colonialism and so on, then it would seem reasonable that it would rupture where it was least well established. And that would have been Russia, and not where it was best established, which would have been in Great Britain or the United States or Germany. And that therefore, the role of the Russian Revolution in this world revolution was to become the vanguard of the working class as a whole, and to help their working class counterparts in other parts of the world to overthrow their states as well. But very quickly, that became problematic. Of course, if you declare openly, to some extent like the Islamic State is currently doing, or Daesh, or whatever you want to call it, that you want to overthrow all the governments of the rest of the world, you create an awful lot of enemies. And those enemies have a great deal of power, and that power can threaten your own security. And indeed it did. As I pointed out before, the Western powers immediately organized counter-revolutionary forces to try to overthrow the communist government. And therefore, very quickly, the aim shifted from being the vanguard of a world revolution to building socialism in one country. Socialism in one country. And what socialism in one country meant is that rather than giving up power, the communists would maintain political power, but would use that political power to transform Soviet society or Russian society and to do the things that capitalism would have done if Russia had gone through that capitalist phase. And what capitalism would have done is revolutionize the agrarian sector to create more efficient agricultural production in order to create an agricultural surplus, which would have then allowed for industrialization in the cities. So the first step in that process was revolutionizing the agrarian sector. And that was accomplished through the forced collectivization of agriculture. The forced collectivization of agriculture had the additional benefit that insofar as the communists faced opposition, it didn't come from the tiny working class in Russia, but came primarily from the more conservative elements in the countryside. Peasants, especially independent peasants, those that were called kulaks. And therefore, the forced collectivization of agriculture had both a political goal of eliminating that opposition and an economic goal of revolutionizing the agricultural sector in order to create industries. At the same time, they built industries through a series of 5-year plans. Now, one of the things that should be noted in this regard is that The Soviet Union, therefore, in a period from 1917 to 1940, developed enough industrial capacity to keep the most powerful country in the planet, which was at that point Germany, at bay and ultimately defeat them in the Second World War. And that's a pretty amazing accomplishment. But they accomplished all of that, something that, a transition that took the British 200 years to accomplish, and subsequent countries considerably longer than the Russians, by substituting for the market, which does this through incentives and through market forces and so on, naked coercion. In other words, it's the state that coerced that transition, and did so with considerable brutality. But nonetheless, it was remarkably successful. And even after bearing the brunt of the Nazi forces during the Second World War, as Khrushchev argued, the Russians were enormously successful in rebuilding their economic system. So much so that when Khrushchev visited the United States in 1962, I believe it was, to give a speech at the UN in New York, he made a rather unfortunate comment to some of the journalists where he stated, "We will bury you." And these journalists went, "Whoa, you will bury us? That's a pretty radical statement." And he immediately backed off and said, "No, that's not what I meant. What I mean is that the Russian system is a more progressive system. And just as feudalism was replaced by capitalism because capitalism was a more progressive system than feudalism, socialism will replace capitalism because it is more successful, it is more progressive." And as evidence, he cited a few things that should have been fairly obvious. The first is that Soviet academies were cranking out 3 times as many engineers as American universities were. Whether the quality of those engineers is still something that may be debatable, but nonetheless, the absolute numbers were correct. Secondly, it defeated Nazi Germany to a far greater extent than other powers. Thirdly, by the mid-1950s, it sent the first spacecraft into orbit, Sputnik, long before the Americans did anything of that sort, demonstrating their enormous technological advances. The Americans estimated in 1949 that it would take the Soviet Union at least 20 years to build a nuclear weapon. The Soviets did it in 4 years. All of that indicated that they were fairly successful, at least on some grounds, but not so very successful on others. And this is a point that we'll pick up on next week when we meet again. I apologize if I took you a little bit too long, or took you a little bit too long. But see you all next week for another exciting episode of Local Politics.